I'd like to welcome you all to this evening of commemoration of the work of Robert Lowell. Those of us who are reading tonight all knew Lowell and were moved to commemorate this 10th anniversary of his death. The people who will be reading will read in alphabetical order, and they are as follows. First, Professor William Alfred, professor of English here at Harvard, playwright and an old friend of Robert Lowell's, an intimate friend of Robert Lowell's. And secondly, Frank Bidart, one of Robert Lowell's literary executors and the editor of the forthcoming collected poetry of Lowell. Frank Bidart is a poet himself and has published 3 volumes of poetry, teaches at Wellesley College. Third, Alan Grossman, a poet and who has published 2 volumes of poetry and who teaches literature at Brandeis University and is a scholar of Yeats and of poetry in general. Next, Seamus Heaney, Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard, the author of an elegy on Robert Lowell, a beautiful elegy on Robert Lowell. And lastly, myself, I'm Helen Vendler, Professor of English here and not a poet and critic. We have each chosen our reading separately according to something we wanted to say or make clear about Lowell's life and work. There'll be a varied sampling of things read, from early work like the Quaker graveyard at Nantucket that Alan Grossman is going to read, on to the last poem in the last book, which I am going to read. So without more ado, I'll begin by letting William Alfred take the stage.
I'm going to begin by reading a letter that Lowell wrote when he was 19 years old to a friend of his. It's not a whole letter, it's just a portion of a letter. And just to give you a sense that he had a head start on all of us. She was a girlfriend. You still seem to regard writing with very little seriousness, a sort of bitter job or platonic daily dozen. No one writes except under the strongest necessity. It may be the need of money, more often perhaps because it is the only way forward. One must not sharply separate realities, an hour for writing, hours for reading, hours for loving, etc. The whole day must be of a piece, not idiotically kennelled off into separate entities. 19. He knew what he was up to. I thought I would read 3 poems tonight. One, the poem which set off the really kind of atomic bomb of a book, Lord Weary's Castle. And I read it because it is a poem which is transitional in Lowell, when he moves from the heavy influence of Eliot's mode, making a poem from found objects of literature, and yet with the brilliance that always was his, being somehow able to transfer his own edginess about the world around him into this complex of references to other things. The Exile's Return, as you will recognize, has references in it to Tony O'Craig of Thomas Mann. And so it reminds me a little bit of Gerontion, the little old man of Eliot's. That's a kind of a shape it is. There mounts in squalls a sort of rusty mire, not ice, nor snow, to leaguer the Hotel de Ville, where braced pig iron dragons grip the blizzard to their rigor mortis. A bell grumbles when the reverberation strip the thatching from its spire. The search guns click and spit and split up timber and nick the slate roofs on the Holstein wall where torn up tile stones crown the victor. We used to call that his Yankee caesura, crown the victor. Fall and winter, spring and summer, guns on limber and lumber down the narrow gabled street past your grey, sorry and ancestral house where the dynamited walnut tree shadows a squat old wind-torn gate and cows the Yankee commandant. You will not see strutting children or meet the peg-leg and reproachful chancellor with a forget-me-not in his buttonhole when the unseasoned liberators roll into the market square, ground arms before the rat house. But already Lily stands, burgeon the risen Rhineland, and a rough cathedral lifts its eye. Pleasant enough, voi che entrate, and your life is in your hands. It's really a fantastic poem. Then I'm going to read a poem out of simple vanity. I talked Lowell into trying to translate it. It's the 37th ode of the first book of Horace's odes that he's adapting. Of course, he's not doing it right. He did one version of it, which I thought was dreadful, in near the ocean. And this is one that is a little nearer. I ought to say about this is that whenever he felt that I needed needling, he used to say, "Don't you agree with me that writing plays is really a rather coarse business?" And then he would go on to say, really when you think of it, Macbeth would be better if it were only the soliloquies. And then there would be an enormous fight. But I like this because he saw what Shakespeare saw in this poem, that is the moment of the turn in the poem. Remember, the poem is Horace saying, now is the time to celebrate. That wretched woman and her degenerate gang are dead. And there are about 4 stanzas of triumph. And then there's a turn. And then it ends as this does. She did not die, an ordinary woman. So that there's that wonderful dramatic thing that Shakespeare uses at the end of Antony and Cleopatra. To give you a sense of, he uses the Eliot thing of using a foreign language in the poem, and it's the first line of the ode. Nunc est bibendum, nunc pede libero. It's an archaic poem. Nunc est bibendum, nunc pede libero. The time to drink and dance the earth in rhythm. Before this, it was infamous to banquet while Cleopatra plotted to enthrone her depravity naked in the capital. Impotent, yet drunk on fortune's favors, Caesar has tamed your soul. You see with a now sober eye the scowling truth of terror. O Cleopatra, scarcely escaping with a single ship, Caesar, 3 decks of oars, oh, scarcely escaping when the sparrowhawk falls on the soft-textured dove. You found a more magnanimous way to die, not walking on foot in triumphant Caesar's triumph. No queen now, but a private woman, much humbled. He gets the kind of understatement at the end of the Horace poem. I like that. I was going to read a poem that I very much like, but I've read it so often it's gone dead on my tongue. So I'm going to read one that I also think is quite beautiful, and it's a poem about his mother. I changed my mind. To Mother. This is from Day by Day, the latest book, the last book. I've come a third time to live in your door, luxurious Boston. I almost lifted the telephone to dial you, forgetting you have no dial. Your exaggerating humor, the opposite of deadpan, the opposite of funny to a son, is mine now. Your bolting blood, your life-wanting face, the unwilled ruffle of drama in your voice. You were Josephine Beauharnais, la femme militaire. The humpback brick sidewalks of Harvard kicked me briskly as if allowed the license of age. Persons who could hardly walk or swallow when I was a student, angrily great like old squirrels with bandages of white hair about their ears. I see myself change in my changed friends. May I live longer, yet break no record. Becoming ourselves, we lose our nerve for children. One crummy plant can inspire a whole room. Yours were not crummy. Bulb, sheath, seductive stem, the lily that lifts its flag a moment puckering on the white pebbles of a whiter pot. Your parlor was a reproach. I wish I were there with you. The minutes not counted, but not forever. You used to brush mantelpiece and banister with the forefinger of a fresh white glove for dust. Why do you keep expecting life to be easy when we know it never can be? I enjoyed hearing scandal on you. Much came from others, your high school friends, themselves now dust. It has taken me the time since you died to discover you are as human as I am, if I am.
There was a similar evening for Lowell 2 weeks ago in New York, and I wrote a little prose thing for it. Because there are fewer of us tonight, I'm going to add a couple of poems and then read the prose I wrote for that evening. I'm going to read 2 poems from For the Union Dead. First, July in Washington. The stiff spokes of this wheel touch the sore spots of the earth. On the Potomac, swan-white power launches keep breasting the sulfurous wave. Otters slide and dive and slick back their hair. Raccoons clean their meat in the creek. On the circles, green statues ride like South American liberators above the breeding vegetation, prongs and spearheads of some equatorial backland that will inherit the globe. The elect, the elected, they come here bright as dimes and die disheveled and soft. We cannot name their names or number their dates. Circle on circle, like rings on a tree. But we wish the river had another shore, some further range of delectable mountains, distant hills powdered blue as a girl's eyelid. It seems the least little shove would land us there, that only the slightest repugnance of our bodies we no longer control could drag us back. And this is titled Buenos Aires. In my room at the Hotel Continental, 1,000 miles from nowhere, I heard the bulky, beefy breathing of the herds. Cattle furnish my new clothes, my coat of limp, chestnut-colored suede, my sharp shoes that hurt my toes. A false fin de siècle decorum snored over Buenos Aires, lost in the pampas and run by the barracks. All day I read about newspaper coup d'etat of the leaden internecine generals, lumps of dough on the chessboard, and never saw their counter-marching tanks. Along the sunlit cypress walks of the Republican martyrs' graveyard, hundreds of one-room Roman temples hugged their neoclassical catafalques. Literal commemorative busts preserved the frog coats and fussy, furrowed foreheads of those soldier bureaucrats. By their brazen doors, 100 marble goddesses wept like willows. I found rest by cupping a soft palm to each hard breast. I was the worse for wear, and my breath whitened the winter air next morning, when Buenos Aires filled with frowning, starch-collared crowds. Oh, to break loose. These are the opening words of Lowell's poem, Waking Early Sunday Morning. The past few days, as I've thought about what I would say tonight, these 4 words keep going through my mind. Oh, to break loose. I think that from these 4 words alone, we know that we're listening to a poem by Robert Lowell. The trouble with criticism, Lowell writes in an essay, is that it makes points. I want to begin as a critic and try to describe a repeated pattern in Lowell's work, an action that lies at the heart of many of his poems. Then I will speak more personally and anecdotally. These lines begin, waking early Sunday morning. Oh, to break loose, like the Chinook salmon jumping and falling back, nosing up to the impossible stone and bone-crushing waterfall. Raw-jawed, weak flesh there, stopped by 10 steps of the roaring ladder, and then to clear the top on the last try, alive enough to spawn and die. The action underlying the stanza is what repeats itself so often in Lowell. The salmon in breaking loose is following its desire, just as more calmly at the end of For the Union Dead. Quote, Colonel Shaw is writing on his bubble. He waits for the blessed break. But once the salmon has achieved the breaking loose that Lowell says he himself desires, to clear the top on the last try, what we see is that breaking loose is part of a pattern, part of the salmon's nature and the nature of the system that it can never escape. The salmon is now alive enough to spawn and die. In the end, skepticism and irony surround our romantic, ineradicable need to break loose. For freedom and law or limits seem at one moment incompatible and at the next indistinguishable. The energy that desired to break loose has found fate. Oh, to break loose. Lowell is preeminently the poet of the desire to break loose. As this desire discovers, often slams into, the laws that govern it. These laws are partly external, war, sickness, death. But more often, as with the Chinook salmon, they are the painful, even tragic laws of our own nature. As the psyche thrashes out into the familial, erotic, political, historical, philosophical waters whirling around it. One way to describe the enterprise, the project of Lowell's writing, is that these laws or patterns, truths, facts that bind the psyche become, as the books proceed, more various, more wide-ranging, the embodiment of more kinds of experience and discourse. The reign of persons, patterns, ironies, objects that block as well as reveal the spirit is everywhere. When we read history, quote, whether we buy less or more has long since fallen to the archaeologist's pick, or when we look into our hearts and write, quote, childhood, closer to me than what I love. In the years I knew Lowell, the growing live enterprise of his work seemed itself to be a breaking loose from the past, to be part of an arc that no one, perhaps not even Lowell himself, could change or deflect. He said to me a number of times that he couldn't write in the styles he had used in the past, that he could only partly choose what he had to write. Lowell revised his poems endlessly, but in the late work, from the sonnet books on, I often feel that I'm reading someone who doesn't give a damn about what he was taught makes a good poem. I feel something like this reading late Montale or late Borges, or in a somewhat different way, the Merrill of the Changing Light at Sandover. The aesthetic underpinnings of modernism made the writing of such poetry possible, but they have been abandoned or swum miles away from. Many people have asked me what it was like to work with Lowell in the last 10 years of his life, to be a kind of sounding board as he wrote new poems. I always have had trouble answering. As practical criticism, the process was easy to describe. He wanted resistance, objections, suggestions. He liked to quote Auden's statement that the best reader is someone who's crazy about your work but doesn't like all of it. That is, the reader should feel enthusiasm and sympathy for the enterprise of the work, yet not be blind to its dead spots or flaws. What I've always found hard to talk about is the constant sense I had in the years Lowell was producing new poem after new poem of the enormous fundamental seriousness, the range and intellectual ambition animating his enterprise. That it was an enterprise and not merely a hit or miss proposition of producing good poems or bad poems. This was true no matter how intimate or directly autobiographical the subject. For example, until near publication, the last line of The Dolphin was, "Why should shark be eaten when the bait swims free?" The line had always seemed somewhat nervously defensive and partial. One night in England, very late, he said that Shakespeare had been lucky in his first editors, Hemming and Condell. In their preface, they had said one of the best things he had ever heard about Shakespeare, that Shakespeare's eyes saw what his hand did. Then we tried to find in Lowell's library an edition of Shakespeare that had Hemming and Condell's preface, but couldn't. The next morning at breakfast, Lowell showed us a new last line for The Dolphin. This is the second half of the book's final poem. Quote, "I have sat and listened to too many words of the collaborating muse, and plotted perhaps too freely with my life, not avoiding injury to others, not avoiding injury to myself. To ask compassion, this book, half fiction, an eel net made by man, for the eel fighting. My eyes have seen what my hand did." The new line in its stoic assertion of and skepticism about his powers, self-divided, even as he asserts the unity between his art and his life, resonates throughout not only this book, but all Lowell's work. When I got back to America and looked up Hemming and Condell, it seemed to me that they are altogether more pedestrian. Quote, "His mind and hand went together, and what he thought he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers." Unquote. By remembering mind as eyes, and those eyes as turned down to look upon the hand itself, by misremembering, Lowell had imagined a more involuted, profounder process and found the end of his book. Here is his last completed poem, finished about a week before he died. It calmly and eerily prefigures his death. Recently, he had been feeling better, though earlier for months he was short of breath with an undiagnosable heaviness in his chest. During that time, once he said to me, referring to Tolstoy's great and terrifying short story, "I feel like Ivan Illich." Here is the poem. Summer Tides. Tonight, I watch the incoming moon swim under 3 agate veins of cloud, casting crisps of false silver plate to the thirsty granite fringe of the shore. Yesterday, the sun's gregarious sparklings. Tonight, the moon has no satellite. All this spendthrift in the house summer, our yacht-jammed harbor, lay unattempted, pictorial to me, like your portrait. I wonder who posed you so artfully for it in the prow of his Italian skiff, like a maiden figurehead without legs to fly. Time lent its wings. Last year, our drunken quarrels had no explanation except everything. Except everything. Did the oak provoke the lightning when we heard its boughs and foliage fall? My wooden beach ladder swings by one bolt and repeats its single creaking rhythm. I cannot go down to the sea. After so much logical interrogation, I can do nothing that matters. The east wind carries disturbance for leagues. I think of my son and daughter and 3 stepdaughters on far-out ledges, washed by the dreaded clock of the waves, gradually rotting the bulwark where I stand. Their father's unmotherly touch trembles on a loosened rail. Thank you.
I will read a poem earlier in the arc of the enterprise than the poems that have already been read. I will read the one poem with 7 parts called The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket. These poems, closer to the beginning of Lowell's labor, perhaps require a somewhat different sort of explanation from the later poems. The poem is not about, but is dedicated to, the poem is dedicated to, but is not about Warren Winslow, dead at sea. Warren Winslow was a cousin who died in a shipping accident in New York Harbor in 1944. The Quaker graveyard in Nantucket, if we were to visit it, would present us with a oceanic, wave-like surface. It has no gravestones. It does not remember by names. It is like the sea and is, in a profound sense, the sea. Lowell's poem is written in the presence of the Second World War, the cause of which he, or his poetry, was inclined to specify as related to Protestantism and Protestant individualism and its radical forms, such as Quakerism, for which he had authority from Melville and Moby Dick, in which the coining of mystery produced the violence that is in part the subject from which the narrator of Moby Dick wishes to separate himself. Throughout the poem, there is both an effort to mourn and to liberate the victims of the death game of possessive individualism identified with Protestantism from their captivity. The God of Protestantism, as Lowell wishes to state it here, is the God of Exodus 3, identified as the verb to be, existence as such, the is and nothing more, unable, therefore, to specify persons, as Lowell was so brilliantly and lovingly able to do in his later writing. As the poem proceeds, the need to find a redemptive position outside of the death game of warfare, Protestantism, generates the sixth section, the only one with a name, called Our Lady of Walsingham, a place of pilgrimage in England, about which it was said that England would come right again when the English went to Walsingham, which the Protestants had ruined in the Reformation. At the end of the poem, there is a much discussed line in which we are told that there is a way of imagining the survival of the Lord beyond the covenanted rainbow of his will, that is to say, beyond the Protestant settlement, which Lowell associates with, in effect, the erasure of the name, which in this great elegy he wishes to restore. He begins with a biblical quotation which describes or announces a confidence which history defeats in the dominion of the Protestant imagination. The Quaker graveyard in Nantucket for Warren Winslow, dead at sea. Let men have dominion over the fishes of the sea, and the fowls of the air, and the beasts of the whole earth, and every creeping creature that moveth upon the earth. 1. A brackish reach of shoal off Nantucket. The sea was breaking violently, and night had steamed into our North Atlantic fleet. When the drowned sailor clutched the dragnet, light flashed from his matted head and marble feet. He grappled at the net with the coiled, hurtling muscles of his thighs. The corpse was bloodless, a botch of reds and whites. Its open, staring eyes were lusterless, dead lights or cabin windows on a stranded hulk, heavy with sand. We weight the body, close its eyes and heave it seaward, whence it came, where the heel-headed dogfish barks its nose on Ahab's void and forehead, and the name is blocked in yellow chalk. Sailors who pitch this portent to the sea, where dreadnought shall confess its hell-bent deity, when you are powerless to sandbag this Atlantic bulwark, faced by the earth shaker, green, unwearied, chaste in his steel scales, ask for no Orphean lute to pluck life back. The guns of the steeled fleet recoil and then repeat the hoarse salute. 2. Whenever winds are moving and their breath heaves at the roped-in bulwarks of this pier, the terns and seagulls tremble at your death. in these home waters? Sailor, can you hear the Pequod's sea wings beating landward, fall headlong, and break on our Atlantic wall off Sconset, where the yawing boats splash the bellbuoy with ballooning spinnakers as the entangled, screeching main sheet clears the blocks of Nantucket, where lubbers lash the heavy surf and throw their long-lead squids for blue fish. Seagulls blink their heavy lids seaward. The wind's wings beat upon the stone's cousin and scream for you, and the claws rush at the sea's throat and wring it in the slush of this old Quaker graveyard, where the bones cry out in the long night for the hurt beast bobbing by Ahab's whaleboats in the east. 3. All you recovered from Poseidon died with you, my cousin, and the harrowed brine is fruitless on the blue beard of the gods stretching beyond us to the castles in Spain, Nantucket's westward haven. To Cape Cod, guns cradled on the tide blast the eelgrass about a water clock of bilge and backwash, roil the salt and sand, lashing earth's scaffold, rock our warships in the hand of the great God, where time's contrition blues, whatever it was, these Quaker sailors lost in the mad scramble of their lives. They died when time was open-eyed, wooden, and childish. Only bones abide there in the nowhere, where their boats were tossed sky high, where mariners had fabled news of is the whited monster. What it cost them is their secret. In the sperm whale's slick, I see the Quakers drown and hear their cry. If God himself had not been on our side, if God himself had not been on our side when the Atlantic rose against us, why, then it had swallowed us up quick. 4. This is the end of the whale road and the whale, who spewed Nantucket bones on the thrashed swell and stirred the troubled waters to whirlpools to send the Pequod packing off to hell. This is the end of them, 3/4 fools, snatching at straws to sail seaward, and seaward on the turntail whale, spouting out blood and water as it rolls sick as a dog to these Atlantic shoals. Clama vemos, O depths. Let the seagulls wail for water, for the deep where the high tide mutters to its hurt south, mutters and ebbs. Waves wallow in their wash, go out and out, leave only the death rattle of the crabs, the beach increasing, its enormous snout sucking the ocean's side. This is the end of running on the waves. We are poured out like water. Who will dance? The mast-lashed master of Leviathans, up from this field of Quakers in their unstoned graves. 5. When the whale's viscera go, and the roll of its corruption overruns this world, beyond tree-swept Nantucket and Woods Hole and Martha's Vineyard, sailor, will your sword whistle and fall and sink into the fat? In the great ash pit of Jehoshaphat, the bones cry for the blood of the white whale. The fat flukes arch and whack about its ears. The death lance churns into the sanctuary, tears the gun-blue swingle, heaving like a flail, and hacks the coiling life out. It works and drags and rips the sperm whale's midriff into rags. Gobbets of blubber spill to wind and weather. Sailor, and gulls go round the stove and timbers where the morning stars sing out together, and thunder shakes the white surf and dismembers the red flag hammered in the mast head. Hide our steel, Jonas, Messias, in thy side. 6, Our Lady of Walsingham. There once the penitents took off their shoes and walked then barefoot the remaining mile. And the small trees, a stream, and hedgerows file slowly along the munching English lane like cows to the old shrine, until you lose track of your dragging pain. The stream flows down under the druid tree. Shiloh's whirlpools gurgle and make glad the castle of God. Sailor, you were glad and whistled Sion by that stream. But see, Our Lady, too small for her canopy, sits near the altar. There's no comeliness at all, or charm in that expressionless face with its heavy eyelids. As before, this face, for centuries a memory, non est species, neque decor, expressionless, expresses God. It goes past castled Sion. She knows what God knows. Not Calvary's cross, nor crib at Bethlehem now, and the world shall come to Walsingham. 7. The empty winds are creaking, and the oak splatters, and splatters on the cenotaph. The boughs are trembling, and a gaff bobs on the untimely stroke of the greased wash exploding on a shoal bell in the old mouth of the Atlantic. It's well. Atlantic, you are fouled with the blue sailors, sea monsters, upward angel, downward fish. Unmarried and corroding spare of flesh, marked once of supercilious wing clippers. Atlantic, where your bell trap guts its spoil, you could cut the brackish winds with a knife, here in Nantucket, and cast up the time when the Lord God formed man from the sea's slime and breathed into his face the breath of life, and blue-lunged combers lumbered to the kill. The Lord survives the rainbow of his will.
Sometime when I was an undergraduate in the late 1950s, I got my hands on the Penguin Book of Contemporary American Verse. and I remember slugging for pleasure through the opaque element of the poem we have just heard. 10 years later, Hugh Staples' book, Robert Lowell, The First 20 Years, came into my hands. And I read Staples' illuminating and elevating account of the Quaker graveyard in Nantucket with great profit and an unthinking assent to its half-stated message that Robert Lowell was already a classic. So when I was introduced to Robert Lowell in London in 1972, in the corner of a party held in his honor, he had just married Lady Caroline Blackwood, and Sheridan was, I don't know what age he was, but Sheridan, I think, was at the marriage too. In the corner of that party, which was run by Sonia Orwell, attended by, among others, Cyril Connolly, when I met him in that context, I was hampered by that lingering undergraduate shyness and by, of course, an Irishman's innate unease in the presence of that upper middle-class English party noise. Here upon poems of mine, he said, they seem to have come through. I myself don't rhyme anymore, etc., etc. These were sonnets of a kind of particularly iambic sort. Anyway, that wasn't that kind of workshop-y thing that mattered, really. I was like other friends of his who knew him far longer and far more personally and more deeply than I did, but I think, like them, I probably valued his friendship because of a sense of privilege in being close to such intellectual stamina, such spiritual force, such attractive rascality, as well as such proven poetic power. You never felt quite safe in Lowell's company, but you never felt sold short. That was one of the thrilling things. Oddly enough, the moment that when I felt most bewildered in his presence was a moment when he himself was bereft of the capacity to unnerve deliberately. I went with him in January 1976 to two acupuncturists in Harley Street in London. Lowell was at that time confined in a small private hospital where I had called to see him earlier in the afternoon and had been given a restorative nip from his imperial lather aftershave bottle, which he had assured me contained Benedictine. I forbear to go through to the prelude to this matter, but I mean, it was a certain connivance between, would you like a drink? Well, no, not really. So I've got a drink. And I was in the presence of a man whom I was told was, you know, M.A.D. And I didn't really know what this meant, and I had never encountered it before, and I didn't know whether to pacify him by agreeing or to come up against him by disagreeing. Anyway, the end of it all, after all the wobbling and toing and froing, was that I did put the damn thing to my head, at least. And of course it was imperial leather shaving. When I went back to Faber and Faber after that, it still lingered on the tongue, you know. And I had to wait till 5:30 to get something to swill it out. So Charles Monteith, who was actually Lowell's editor as well as my own, and a rather booming had a rather booming high Oxford voice. So as I nipped down the stairs to get a pint to take this taste off my mouth, Charles shouted out to me, "Slipping out for an aftershave, are you?" Anyway, sorry. But after that moment, as it were, almost to after the moment of drinking the stuff, in order to atone in a way, I suppose. He brought me away in a taxi with this male nurse, who was always in attendance, into the inner sanctum of these two friendly and, it appeared to me, I have to say, slightly quackish acupuncturists. Stealthy, stooped, and vaguely insinuating elders from the city of Leeds. They called him Professor. They spoke calmingly, and he became calm. He answered their questions about what they called his tension with an unexpectedly childlike candor. He allowed them to palp along the line of his neck, over his temples, down the back of his skull. He took off his shirt. He bowed a little and accepted the needles one by one in a delicate, gleaming line from the point of his shoulder to the back of his ear. At that moment, I must say, I did have a great feeling of intimacy, of honor, and of heartbreak, watching it from behind, as it were, and finding it impossible to stop myself turning the moment into an image there and then. Gulliver in Lilliput, I thought immediately. Disabled, pinned down, yet essentially magnificent. The bull weakened by the peaks of the picador, or, and I suspect this is the image he would have liked himself, Saint Sebastian. At any rate, it does remain this moment an emblem of his afflicted life, of his great native strength, and of his sorrowfully invigilated helplessness. But there was a happier moment which preceded that. This was in County Wicklow in 1975, a moment I remember with great pleasure. A small gate lodge, very small, peopled by my wife, myself, our two small sons and infant, 3-year-old daughter, really. We were necessarily in that condition, as they say, thrown together a lot as a family. And in a way to which Cal, who was not altogether the domestically compelled, you might say, he wasn't used to this intimacy with nappies and youngsters, because he was living at that stage in an English country house. But I remember the great pleasure he took in saying to me, over the top of the glasses, "You see a lot of your children." And he did visit on and off over the years to a house where there were children, where Mary and myself were very domestic, and himself and Caroline would come occasionally out of the big country house in Dublin, Castletown, into this suburban house where children were running about. And I suppose it gave them a chance to masquerade as a domestic couple for a while themselves. At least I've often thought that is perhaps part of the strange tenderness and merriment that pervaded those meetings. Was that, I mean, these veterans, everybody who lives together for a few years is a veteran of the battlefield of marriage, but these were particularly post-Trojan victims. But at any rate, there was both great joyfulness, tenderness, and a kind of blank knowledge also. So to commemorate his laconic joys in marriage, his great self-knowledge, and his great tenderness, I'll read the poem from Day by Day called Marriage. We were middle class and verismo enough to suit Van Eyck when we crowded together in Maidstone, patriarch and young wife, with our 3 small girls to pose in Sunday best. The shapeless comfort of your flowered frock was transparent against the light, but the formal family photograph in colour shows only a rousing brawn of shoulder to tell us you were pregnant. Even there, Sheridan, though unborn, was a centre of symmetry. Even then he was growing and hiding towards gaucheness and muscle, to be a war chronicler of vast inaccurate memory. Later, his weird humour made him elf and dustman, like him, early risers. This summer, he is a soldier. Unlike father or mother or anyone he knows, he can choose both sides, Redcoat, Minuteman, or George III. The ambivalence of the revolution that made him half British, half American. I turn to the Arnolfini marriage and see Van Eyck's young Italian merchant was neither soldier nor priest. In an age of faith, he is not abashed to stand weaponless, long-faced and dwindling in his bridal bedroom. Half Jewish, perhaps, he is freshly married and exiled for his prophet to Bruges. His wife's with child. He lifts a hand, thin and white as his face, held up like a candle to bless her, smiling, swelling, blossoming. Giovanni and Giovanna. Even in an age of costumes, they seem to flash their fineness, better dressed than kings. The picture is too much like their life, a crisscross, too many petty facts. This bedroom with one candle still burning in the candelabrum and peaches blushing on the windowsill. Giovanni's high-heeled raw wooden slippers thrown on the floor by her smaller ones, dyed sang de boeuf to match the restless marital canopy. They are rivals in homeliness and love. Her hand lies like china in his. Her other hand is in touch with the head of her unborn child. They wait and pray, as if the airs of heaven that blew on them when they were married were now a common visitation, not a miracle of lighting for the photographer's sacramental instant. Giovanni and Giovanna, who will outlive him by 20 years. That's it. Thank you.
We all have anecdotes about things we liked about Lowell. I particularly liked his Boston poems because I came from Boston, and it was a Boston poem that first caught my attention. In an anthology, there's a bridge down by Charles Circle that is the Longfellow Bridge over the Charles, but it's known familiarly as the Pepper Pot Bridge because the towers on it look like old-fashioned salt and pepper canisters when they had big ones instead of shakers, the way we have now. And I too, as Seamus Heaney saw the Quaker graveyard in his anthology, in my anthology, I saw the first poem I had ever consciously known to be about my own city. It's one of Lowell's apocalyptic, prophetic, doom-laden poems about Boston. He speaks of walking or seeing Boston where the pepper pot, ironic rainbow, spans Charles River and its scales of scorched earth miles. I saw my city in the scales, the pans of judgment rising and descending. Dead leaves char the air, and I am a red arrow on this graph of revelations. Every dove is sold, and it's an unpropitiatory moment when every dove is sold. But the notion of that line, the poet that could say to where, I saw the pepper pot ironic rainbow where Charles River, spanning Charles River in its scales of scorched earth miles, I saw my city in the scales. It seemed to me a wonderful thing to be able to say. And Lowell's subsequent Boston poems, including the beautiful one about the Robert Gould Shore Memorial and so forth, have been among my favorites. He wrote a poem, a lovely poem, towards the end of his life called Bright Day in Boston. It was a life that was having a lot of hard times, God knows, in terms of physical, mental, moral, and spiritual events, but this was a single nice day that happened, and so he gave the title Bright Day in Boston to this poem. and he handed it to me to read, and it began, to my way of thinking astonishingly, joy of standing up my dentist, my x-ray plates, like a broken apocalypse, joy to idle through Boston, so forth. And I mean, I couldn't take in the poem very well. I said, did you really stand up your dentist? I mean, a thing that had never occurred to me to do. And he said, oh no, but since it was a poem about breaking loose, to refer to Frank Bidart's urge, I had to begin it that way. Actually, I went to the dentist first and then took the walk. As an anecdote about life and art, you put in what will work in the poem, whatever you did in life. Joy of standing up my dentist. The other revelation to me in my anthology, along with reading about the pepper pot ironic rainbow, I had also read The Quaker Graveyard in Nantucket, and I had never read a poem quite like it. As you can imagine, there wasn't anything like it around, and there was all this terrific, terrifying noise and boiling images and hurtles of whales and broken ships and lances and big blubbers of whales and cutting through the whale's blubber and Ahab and the mast and the flag nailed to the mast and all of that. And I read all of this churning around in my head, not understanding a word, but having all the images churning around. And then I went to see the Quaker Graveyard at Nantucket, and there was nothing there. And it was the first time I realized what imagination was. I was only 17, but suddenly I knew that you took a perfectly ordinary hill of unmarked grass, and you made this great boiling thing over it. And that was, to me, as a 17-year-old, just astonishing. I really did understand to make something out of nothing, and that's what it was. I'm going to read two poems. One of them is the poem to that child you've heard mentioned twice tonight, Sheridan, Lowell's son, born when Lowell was 5 years old when his father died. 15 now, I guess. Most of us haven't seen him since Lowell's funeral. He looks extraordinarily like his father, or did then, so much so that a picture of Lowell, when Lowell was a baby of 3 or 4, looked to him exactly like his own son at that age. And it's eerie to have cloned yourself so completely, physically. And the family monogram that's stamped on the generational silver, the LLLL going down the Lowell silver as it's collected, or the WWW of the Winslow silver, more likely it's his mother's silver he mentions. That sense of the genetic pattern repeating like the family monogram on the family silver is one of the metaphors that's behind the astonishing replication of self in a child. And if you've had the difficult life that Lowell had, if you've been mad, if you've been hospitalized 18 times in 20 years for manic depressive illness, as he said once, to think that you've replicated your soma in a child is particularly troubling. And the notion of what you can do for that child and what life will be for that child is a reflection that even an unmotherly father can't escape. So I'm going to read a poem about his son, Sheridan, and then I'm going to read the last poem in the last book, which he entitled Epilogue, although he did write some poems after that, as you've heard from Frank Bidart. But I want to say a few words first as a critic, too. In his young essay on Hopkins, he wrote an essay on Hopkins collected in a small volume called The Kenyon Critics. Now it's in his collected prose. In that young essay on Hopkins, Lowell unforgivingly said about Pope, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Arnold, and Browning, that, quote, after a certain point, all these men, all of them great writers at times, stopped living. They began to reflect, to imagine, to moralize. Some single faculty kept on moving and fanning the air, but the whole man had stopped. Consequently, in their writings, they mused, they fabled, they preached, they schemed, and they damned everything except poesis, so to speak, after they had stopped living. When he wrote that, it was without a knowledge of how hard it is in middle age not to stop living as a whole person, and to become instead what Wallace Stevens called the final dwarf of the self. Day by day, the last book is the best evidence that in Lowell, the whole man kept on living at the always painful cost of new personal enterprises and new self-criticism. There are many moments of self-criticism in Day by Day, moral self-criticism and aesthetic self-criticism, criticism of himself as a man, criticism of himself as a writer. There are many moments of such self-criticism, and I'm choosing two of them. I would, in choosing two poems of this sort, not want to make Lowell into a plaster saint, that is, someone who went from virtue to virtue of self-criticism. His guilts were well-founded, not least his guilt towards his two children. The parental guilt found in Sheridan is founded on Lowell's sense that besides being the wounding parent, he is the wounded child. I'm quoting from a line from the sonnets, "Always inside me is the child that died. Always inside me is his wish to die." The extraordinary physical resemblance between himself as a child and Sheridan as a child stands in this poem for the mysterious continuity of family, gender, and identity in biological reproduction. The poem is written past 50 when he said, "We lose our nerve for children." It's a terrible thing to engender a child that will be sure to grow up after you die, almost. Lowell's parents had died at 60. To engender a child at 55 when your genetic inheritance is so short. This poem, written past 50, turns on its own cruel paradoxes of failure and hope, but they are the same paradoxes that anyone who has had a child feels. It quotes St. Paul, "We see now through a glass darkly," and you can see the change that has been made about seeing through a glass darkly. For Sheridan, we only live between before we are and what we were. In the lost negative, you exist, a smile, a cipher, an old-fashioned face and an old-fashioned hat. 3 ages in a flash, the same child in the same picture, he, I, you, chock-a-block, one stamp like mother's wedding silver. Gnome, fish, brute cherubic force. We could see clearly and all the same things before the glass was hurt. Past 50, we learn with surprise and a sense of suicidal absolution that what we intended and failed could never have happened and must be done better. The last poem turns on, like so many poems, watching television, only it's hidden in the poem. He offers a quotation in the poem contrasting the painter with the photographer. And photography is the quintessential modern and perhaps American art, and painting is the quintessential European art. Sir Kenneth Clark, as Lowell remembered it, in giving his lectures in that series called Civilization, had made this unflattering comparison, unflattering to photography, representing the painter's relationship to his medium and to light as an eroticized one, whereas, of course, the lens can never be erotic. Lowell had been criticized by many critics, including his old mentors, for writing the sort of poetry he wrote when he turned away from the religious and prophetic dimension of the Quaker graveyard and poems like that into those poems called life studies, those unflattering pictures of his family. And he felt like somebody he felt as though he were being criticized, like somebody who had presented a family snapshot of unflattering pictures, awkwardly grouped to be admired as art. Family albums never are very artistic things. And the idea of redoing the photograph to make it aesthetic, as was done in the famous Iwo Jima case, where the original, at least according to legend, the original flag raising on Iwo Jima was photographed, and everybody was sort of hit or miss, helter-skelter, putting up the flag. And this didn't make a dramatic picture at all, so then everyone was carefully reposed in a nice ascending sort of triangle, lifting up the flag, as though that were the authentic moment. You can rearrange your snapshots, of course, but Lowell felt he didn't care to do that. On the other hand, anyone brought up on the harmonies and beauties of European painting or European poetry looks at modernist snapshot art with some misgiving in your own taste, so that it's hard to know whether you're justified in continuing with a certain kind of ugliness that seems to you necessary. And the epilogue is a self-defense. It plays on the two words we have in English for camera work, snapshot, and that says exactly what it is, and the more literary word, photograph, which of course means writing with light. The quotation he rephrases in his own voice about the erotic and beautiful relation of the painter to his canvas. Epilogue. Those blessed structures, plot and rhyme, why are they no help to me now I want to make something imagined, not recalled? I hear the noise of my own voice. The painter's vision is not a lens. It trembles to caress the light. But sometimes everything I write with the threadbare art of my eye seems a snapshot, lurid, rapid, garish, grouped, heightened from life, yet paralyzed by fact, all's misalliance. And the poem comes to a halt. Then there's a wonderful second wind, and one of the nicest things about Lowell is that he could have second and third and fourth and fifth winds. And he thinks of the thing that links him with those European painters whose hand trembled to caress the light. And he thinks of what they had in common, which was motive rather than end result, that the motive is accuracy. And Vermeer wanted to be accurate in painting his pregnant girl reading the letter from her beloved as the map behind her stands as a frame for her figure. And the light comes in through the casement window over the map and makes her human solidity so palpable. Vermeer wanted to be accurate, but he wanted to be accurate too. And here's the second wind. But sometimes everything I write with the threadbare art of my eye seems a snapshot, lurid, rapid, garish, grouped, heightened from life, yet paralyzed by fact, all's misalliance. Yet why not say what happened? Pray for the grace of accuracy Vermeer gave to the sun's illumination, stealing like the tide across a map to his girl solid with yearning. We are poor passing facts, warned by that to give each figure in the photograph his living name.